What are you doing?
Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Hello. In this investigation, I'm looking at how influential editing is in the horror genre, and how it can be completed in a way that can either heighten the audience attention or completely ruin the experience of watching the film in the first place. I intend to find out what films have managed to produce excellent visuals and audio in the past, and those that have not. My prediction is that I'll find a number of films that managed to create magnificent, breathtaking visuals, spine-chilling suspense, scariness, and overall watchability, but didn't get the recognition they deserved, whether this be from the box office, cinema, or film festivals. I will look at both sides of my investigation and study those films that won Oscars and why they did, and those that did not and why they didn't. I've always been fascinated by the horror genre and what certain directors have been able to make me feel when I watch their films. Ever since I could comprehend what I thought was scary, I've been watching horror films ever since. Now, I'm not saying I'm the horror film editing master, but I'd like to think I've seen enough horror films to know what I think is nice. There has always been editing in film, and especially in the horror genre, because in order to make something scary, they might not be able to conform to our reality. Therefore, editors and sound designers have led to overcome this with various methods. Editing in horror films has been present since the birth of the genre. Ever since the original King Kong in 1933, sound designers and editors have been trying to make the images you see on screen as scary as possible for the audience. Some of the first films were completely silent and were only a couple of seconds long, but because people had never seen moving pictures before, it was like a completely different reality. A prime example of this could be Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat. It was said that when this 50-second film first aired in theatres, people ran out of the picture house thinking the train was going to hit them. A fun fact about this film actually is that someone, somewhere, digitally upscaled it to 4K 60 frames per second. And I don't even know how they did it, but you can watch it now and I'll show it to you. And it is the same clip. Just have that in mind, it's the same clip. And then look at the quality. I just thought that would be interesting to share, really. Although this wasn't the first video ever made, it was definitely enough to scare some people. And that wasn't even their aim. I want to start this case study off by saying I think Hereditary is one of the best horror films to come out in the last few years, and I really mean that. The overall consensus is that the horror community completely agrees with me, as the film gathered 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb and 89% audience satisfaction rate on Rotten Tomatoes, and overall enjoyment being 71%. Ari Aster knew what he was doing when he set out to make this film, and is completely evident. The film was edited by Lucian Johnston, who was nominated twice in 2018 for the Best Editor and once more in 2019. This film is important because it has everything a modern horror film should accommodate: scariness, uncomfortableness, tension, and disgust, to name a few. The first scene I want to talk about is between 32 minutes and 35 minutes 40. The accident sequence. This is one of the most important scenes in the whole film, as it sets up the plot for what happens to the family. It starts with Charlie being escorted out of the party by Peter, as she's having a serious allergic reaction to some of the peanut cake she ate previously. Peter has to quickly rush off to the hospital. Already we can gather that this scene is supposed to be extremely tense, and Aster and Johnston managed to portray the tension and stress incredibly, but not in the way you would expect. Each shot is uncomfortably long, with no quick cuts to different angles unless necessary. This can affect the audience's response, as we want the scene to be fast-paced and dramatic, but Aster and Johnston won't give it to us. They want us to wait and be drawn in by the tension, and be in the same shoes as Peter. What follows after this is nothing short of a visual masterpiece.
It's okay, Charlie, we're almost to the hospital, okay?
The music by Colin Stetson, as well as all the other Foley artists and sound designers, is subtle yet extremely effective. Perfect tempo, rhythm, and structure for what is happening on screen. You want the audience to be utterly drawn in with what the director wants you to see, and it takes an extremely skilled of sound designers, composers, and editors to help portray an important sequence of events accurately, especially when your only source of doing so is sound. And I feel like this was achieved to the nth degree when Charlie's head is decapitated. All momentum and pace in the music are whipped away in an instant, leaving the audience with nothing to listen to apart from Peter's slow, shallow breathing. Making this scene even more uncomfortable. With further regards to the editing, I conducted some primary research which consisted of about 15 to 20 people and their opinions on how important is compelling visuals for the success of horror films. On a scale of 1 to 10, the average answer was 8. This can help further enforce my point that intricate editing is important, if not necessary, for the success of the genre. As well as this, not once in the whole 3-minute scene was I ever comfortable. This could be because of the subwoofer lullaby that is prominent throughout, the low whir to help keep the audience attentive. The audience should be on edge the whole time, and with shots this long and cutting few and far between, it is safe to say that this scene is extremely admirable, and it perfectly shows off what good filmmaking should consist of. But Asta has not got enough praise yet. There is another scene I want to talk about. Between 1 hours 51 and 1 hour 56, the ending sequence. This scene specifically stands out as being spectacularly disturbing in every way possible, and couldn't have been done without the use of Johnston's amazing work. What intrigues me about this scene is the use of extremely long takes, which we have grown accustomed to throughout the whole film, and is prominent in Ari Aster's other work. With no cuts and agonizingly slow panning. Aster obviously wants the audience to feel this way because the tension this scene builds up is enough for most people to induce a small panic attack. When the camera pans painfully slowly towards Chris's dead father's charred body on the floor, the music seems to be connected to what Chris is feeling. The harsh violin orchestra, mixed with obnoxiously loud wind instruments, crescendo as Chris finds the body, as if the film is trying to tell us the shock, awe and disbelief that he is feeling. Furthermore, I think that the sheer lack of editing in this scene alone is what makes it infinitely more horrifying to watch. Because at its core, the plot is scary enough for the audience anyway, and Johnston doesn't want to take away that feeling of being utterly immersed and terrified by what we're seeing on screen. As the scene continues, so does the tension. The music suddenly quietens down to a whisper, and the camera focuses on Chris's mother clinging to the ceiling. Once again, calling back to the idea that the music is linked to Chris's emotions. As Annie makes a noise, alerting Chris to her presence, what follows is an anxiety-ridden chase of Chris and his own demon-possessed mother, but not as fast-paced as you think. Once again, The lack of editing in these sequences is what sets them apart from other scenes from other films. Many editors choose to use fast cuts to accentuate the tension and anxiety the character is feeling, but Johnston and Astor decided to evidently choose a different approach, using the lack of fast-paced editing trickery and letting the audience use their brains to fill in the rest, which in most cases seems to be much scarier. The Snowman, produced in 2017, directed by Alfredson, edited by Claire Simpson, was considered one of the worst modern horror films to be released within the last few years, and was widely considered to be a catastrophe in terms of visuals and sound, scoring a measly 5 out of 10 globally and 2.5 stars on IMDb, with a 7% audience satisfaction rate. It's no wonder the film did as bad as it did. Don't get me wrong, the film looks spectacular at times, but that's no use when the audience becomes annoyed and confused because they aren't being drawn in as they should. The Snowman had a number of problems when filming, which ended up costing the production team the popularity they were aiming for, and leaving the post-production team with less time to master their craft, which is evident because of the sheer amount of continuity errors and editing errors in general scattered around the film. A few examples are, every time Kilmer's character speaks, you can easily tell his voice is dubbed over with someone else's. Detective Harry Hole breaks into Katrine's apartment with a kick, leaving the door open. After a brief fight between the both, the door is closed again, despite never being shown in the film. The different snowmen throughout the movie change between camera shots, with no connection to the story. With exceptions to the first issue, the other two problems are continuity errors, which can sometimes be fixed by editing if done properly. This is obviously not what you want to see when trying to indulge in a serious horror film. You do not want to be noticing these issues whilst watching. It takes away from the experience and draws the audience out of the world they're supposed to be sucked into.
Too short. Maybe she was afraid.
What about you, Harry? You have a woman who loves you. A boy who's devoted to you. Why did you abandon them?
They deserve better.
Too easy.
Because I'm selfish. I'm an addict. There isn't enough room for them.
I want to talk about this specific scene from the film, as it stood out for me for the wrong reasons. The editing specifically here is poor. The scene is supposed to be building tension and drama, but it purely makes me want to skip forward. As the metal wire tightens around the woman's neck, the camera doesn't physically zoom in as it should have. Instead, an artificial zoom is added on, and too much motion blur is used, in this instant making the scene seem almost comedic. Instead of using an in-body camera zoom, like they should have, the choice to artificially zoom in is somewhat of a rookie mistake, as when you zoom in without actually zooming in, it destroys the physical quality of the video and should only be done if the scene requires it, which in this case, I don't think it did. Instead of using a fast zoom back out, Simpson uses a slow, gradual zoom back to the full frame, completely diminishing the barely built up tension gathered in the previous scene. The use of artificial zoom is prominent throughout the rest of the scene, instead in conjunction with poor sound design. The fight scene doesn't seem intense at all, even though this is what Alfredson wanted it to be. Every sound coming from the film seems to be poorly dubbed in afterwards, with chair and table sounds that shouldn't sound like the way they did, and the metal wire contraption sounding like a bloody laser gun from out of space. The only thing about this scene that I can take away from is just how poor everything seemed to be done, making the audience wonder where all the $35 million went. An American Werewolf in London, directed by John Landis, edited by Malcolm Campbell, was absolutely outstanding in terms of visual editing back in 1981, gathering an amazing overall enjoyment rate of 92%, 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb, and 87% on Rotten Tomatoes. And Amazon even rated the whole film 4.7 out of 5 stars anyway. However, in this analysis, we'll be talking about the famous transformation scene, which was especially recognised as being the most disturbing and gruesome scene to ever come out of a horror film. Especially because the bar was set very high at the time in terms of visual effects. Everyone was trying to make the horror genre more horrible. Examples of movies competing at the time were Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, Stephen King's Pet Sematary, just to name a few. What stands out in this scene is the sheer amount of detail put into the transformation. The hair, the eyes, the ears, everything is there. I find it amazing that this amount of detail that special effects artists were able to create in the 80s. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to see the film in theatres. As well as the terrifying visuals, the sound design was impeccable for the time.
Call him Meatloaf Jack!
We can hear bones stretching, skin tearing, and gut-wrenching screams of pain. This all adds to the audience sense of disgust and uncomfortableness, which is absolutely necessary when making a horror film. However, looking back on this film and comparing it to what we have today, it can definitely say how editing has changed, and how much more the audience demands from the genre, as simple shock and awe won't suffice anymore. If this film were to be made today, it would never have done as well as it did in '81, and I think that speaks for itself. Editing has changed since 1981, and has truly pulled off some amazing work in the last 10 years. But we all have films like these to thank for it, pulling off incredibly brave CGI stunts for the time. In conclusion, I believe that visual and sound editing is extremely important in horror films especially, no matter the age of the film. Although I have only talked about 3 examples in this analysis, there are countless movies that portray true horror film values and pull them off seamlessly. And I congratulate the directors and editors for it. There are also other films, like The Snowman, that somehow manage to have all the equipment and means of making a great film that just completely flop, in terms of how it is all put together. Whether this be because of the director or the editorial team, editing will always be important in film, and can drastically change the way the audience reacts to the film. Thank you for listening.